Hi, thanks everybody, and welcome again to this innovation webinar series. So it's been nice to get this going again. Many of you will have joined sessions before. I recognize some of your names. We took a pause in the summer as I took a short sabbatical, but this is our first one as we run up to the end of the year. So our first one in October, there'll also be one in November and in December. And this was an interesting one because it's building upon some of the topics from previous session that was actually very popular and very well received about not just innovation climate, but also process factors that have an impact in engagement in innovation and innovation performance. So we decided to do a bit of a deep dive on this topic of innovation climate, specifically the 6 leadership behaviors that I talked about last time, and start to talk a little bit more about what these climatic factors are and make it very practical. So what I hope is that you take away from this are very tangible steps that any organization can apply that's going to make a significant difference to creating an environment within which innovation can thrive. So these are the climatic factors, let's say, and you might be wondering what innovation climate is, but these are the sort of infrastructure and the environmental considerations that foster a more innovative company. They foster innovative behaviors within your organization and make an organization feel more innovative. Now, there are many factors when it comes to innovation climate that we could consider, and I have cherry-picked 6, which I think are practical and relatively straightforward to implement for most organizations. There are many more. Some are harder to do, some take more time, some are probably a webinar in their own right. But I've picked out 6, and maybe if we have time towards the end, we might also put it out to you, which you think perhaps should be talked about some more. What environmental considerations could you put in place? What I've also done is to focus on things that I think are within the remit of organizational leaders to implement. So if you're in a leader in your organization, these are practical steps that you should be able to apply to your own organizations. They're not just very high level concepts. I'm going to really talk about the details of those. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Colin Nelson. I am Chief Innovation Consultant here at Hype. I've been working in the innovation industry for more than 20 years, initially as a corporate entrepreneur and business development manager. For the last sort of 15, 20 years or so, I've been working as a consultant to a whole range of different organizations of all kinds of shapes and sizes, mostly medium to large organizations, some communities, some ecosystems. And I'm very lucky, I think, to work in this way across the innovation industry. I'm also a strong believer in the ISO 56000 set of standards. So where possible today, I'm going to try and link up some of those climate factors to ISO. I see we've got Andrew Stanton on the call. So again, Andrew, you might want to chip in with some thoughts as we go through this, because I'm a believer that as we start to put better and more sustainable business processes in place for innovation, creating environments within which innovation can thrive, it's very helpful to have consistency across the picture. I also have some personal passions. I'm a big believer in collective intelligence and how complex groups of people come together to be creative and solve problems. So actually the reason that we had a 2-month pause on these webinars is because I was actually away writing a book on collective intelligence, which hopefully we should have published before the end of the year. More on that in the future. And as always, we offer a free consultation. So there's a quick survey at the end of the webinar. You'll be able to use this QR code now, or at the end, I'll bring it back again. If you fill in a little survey about what you think, things that you liked, things that you'd like to see covered in the future, you get entered into a hat for a free consultation. And I really enjoy doing those. I often speak to people that I would never have crossed paths with in the past. We talk all things innovation, and we get about 45 minutes just to explore what you're working on, what you're struggling with, perhaps I'll offer you some advice and guidance as we go. So just like the last session, in many ways, I'm going to be talking about things that I don't think organizations are very good at. So this is not necessarily going to be an example heavy piece of content, where in the past you will have seen me try to put illustrative examples out there in terms of what good practice is and good examples from clients that I've worked with. This is going to be relatively light on examples because in many ways, as per the last session, we're talking about stuff which isn't, I think, well adopted or is lacking in maturity. And so I think it's helpful for us to think about where we want to get to rather than just looking at an example of an organization that perhaps isn't quite as good as I would like it to be in this particular zone. Wherever possible, I'll share some examples, but it's not going to be an example rich session. It's going to be much more of a kind of a dream and a hope and an aspirational session, I think, for folks. Okay, so let's move on and talk about what innovation climate really means. The way to think about it, or I like to think about it, is good innovation infrastructure. What's around you that helps foster an employee, a manager, a leader to be more innovative? What is it that's around us that fosters innovation behaviors? So something that perhaps we would do today, we might not have done in the past because of something else that's around them in the organization. And if that seems a bit high level, this hopefully will make sense as we push forward. And these building blocks specifically around climate are things I believe leaders in organizations should strive for. Even if you're not an innovation leader, but you're a leader in an organization, these are things that you can do to help foster an environment where innovation can thrive. And as I said, they're going to be really practical elements, but there's not an exclusive list. And I want to just talk about a prerequisite to some of this stuff in a second, because there are many, many factors. And there's one specifically that I'm not deep diving into because we've touched on it in other sessions in the past, but is relevant to this overall conversation, which will make sense again in the future. And that's related quite closely to the employee engagement problem. So when we talk about environmental climate factors, well, why is that important anyway? And the reason, of course, is we want people to get involved in innovation. We want to have more agile, more creative organizations where we foster innovation behaviors. But we're working within an environment where our employees have never been less engaged. So last year, Gallup did their survey, their annual survey, and it's down to 21% of most employees being engaged in what they're trying to do. So that's 4 in 5 of your employees are disengaged, which I think intuitively all know is a problem. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're leaving, although higher attrition rates are an element of that, but it certainly means lower levels of commitment, fewer employees going above and beyond the job. We're simply not getting the maximum out of the employees that we have. And when at a time when innovation has never become more important, getting as much out of our greatest asset, our people, is critical. So I'm just sort of setting the scene here in terms of why innovation climate is important, because this can be changed. And perhaps you're wondering, well, what does disengagement look like? Well, I've got a whole range of employee complaints that I hear. So these are the sorts of things that you might hear. I don't believe this organization is heading in the right direction. I don't believe we're investing in the right things, or everything seems too short-term focused. Perhaps there's a feeling that no one listens to the individuals that actually know how things work. And hey, no one's really interested in my experiences or what I've learned in my previous roles, and that's frustrating for people. All of these things create a level of disengagement, frustration, and ultimately a lack of engagement in the organizational direction. And this is a genuine challenge for us, because what we're the environmental factors in terms of our level of volatility, the regularity of disruption, is problematic. The constant change doesn't feel comfortable for your average employee. It may be necessary to thrive and survive, but it's not comfortable. And if we have a lack of a voice or a lack of influence, that can create a lack of engagement. And of course, we have disrupting factors like emerging technology, which may well make people fearful for whether they have a job, whether technology is going to replace them. There's also this distance between the strategic and the employee in terms of decision makers and where we're trying to get to. That disconnect, of course, leads to further lack of value coming from our employees when it comes to innovation. So this is the environment in which we work. I'm sure some of you will feel that lack of engagement. I've spoken to organizations of all types of shapes and sizes, and this is a really common problem. But if we get these things right and we put these innovative climate elements in place, what we do see is that this is something that we can bridge. This could be very different. Some organizations that with enterprise innovation programs report up to 80% engagement year on year. That's pretty phenomenal. One that springs to mind and that I can share with you is Polpharma. So it's the Polish pharmaceutical company. They put in place an enterprise innovation management program. They put in place an advocate program. They supported it with comms. They have rewards and recognition programs. It really do all the things that we would like to see. And every year they see up to 80% of people engaging with their innovation program. Now, that's not engagement in its entirety, but certainly a significant part. If we're excited about the future of our organization, if we can see it's heading in a direction where it can thrive, then of course that is going to lift the level of engagement that we see. And we've done our own studies on how engaging people in innovation and change can help change the behaviors that we see, but also the results and feelings of engagement. And we've seen in certain cases double-digit improvements on employee surveys as a result of involving people in the future direction of the company. So the great news here is that although we're in an environment where engagement's tough, we can fix it by putting in place some key building blocks. But I'd also like to consider what kind of culture we'd like to see. And culture really is a collection of behaviors. There's perhaps a way to see that if you're not sure what I mean by culture. The sorts of things we want to see are leaders sharing ideas, but also problems. We want them to say, you know, I'm not sure about this. Can you help me? That's quite an engaging conversation. We want to see employees sharing their insights. You know, maybe they went to a conference, they saw something cool. We maybe do have an idea for something new. We want to create an ability for them to do that in a way that's meaningful and can actually be commercialized. We want to see concept owners asking for help when they're not sure, not just banging their head against the wall and hoping that this is going to get fixed and get better in the future. And of course, many of us work for medium or large organizations. We've got silos and parallel activities. We want to see increased levels of collaboration across those silos, because what we know for sure as innovators is that more diversity of perspective tends to build more creativity. So this is our dream. And when I talk about engagement and innovation, these are the sorts of behaviors that we want to see increase that will help stimulate innovation. But to do that, that's where we need to ensure we have those climate factors that I'm about to move on to. Before I do that, I just wanted to show you something that many of you will have seen before, which is our innovation building blocks approach. These are the 14 elements that help underpin innovation performance, and they are derived directly from the ISO standard, ISO 56000. If you read the ISO standards, what you'll see within a clause, you'll have maybe 4 or 5 different things that you need to care about. This is essentially presenting that back to you in a way which is meaningful, enables you to create specific actionable elements to help improve innovation performance. And if you wished to pursue ISO accreditation in the future, this will get you closer to it. It doesn't include everything that's important here, but it's the most meaningful parts of the ISO standard for innovation management. And I'm going to be touching on quite a lot of these different elements, because when we talk about climate factors, we're going to be dipping in and out of all of these different areas. So those of you who've seen this before, great. For those of you who haven't, you might want to give it a quick skim. There should be no rocket science there for you. It's all stuff that most innovators would recognize as being important. Probably some stuff you do very well, some stuff perhaps less good at. The colors on the left-hand side are broken into these 4 elements of strategic elements, capability elements, innovation pipeline elements, and communication elements. And that's a loose clustering. There is overlap and gray areas between these elements. We find this is a really helpful way of starting to structure what an innovation roadmap for improving performance really looks like. That's just setting the scene. Good. So what constitutes a good innovation climate? These are the 6 leadership activities or behaviors that I think we can start to address if we're trying to create an environment where people feel more engaged with innovation. I'm going to touch upon those in detail in a second, but I want to first address a prerequisite. Most organizations that leverage these elements also have some form of collective intelligence program. They have something that allows them to engage with most, if not all, of the organization and leverage the collective intelligence of the fringes of the organization, not just the core people. That's important because even if we put all these things in place, if we don't have the ability for individuals to participate in innovation, we're not going to see those improvements in innovation behaviors that we want to see. But I'm not going to deep dive into collective intelligence because we've got lots of webinars about it. If you'd like to talk more about that with me, I'm very happy to do so. See that as a prerequisite, as the ability to harness the collective intelligence of the organization and foster an engagement within innovation, irrespective of where your employee is based. So see that as a prerequisite. So I'm going to go through these 6. So I'm going to start off with, we cluster them into 2s. So I'm going to start off with a portfolio approach and protecting funding for innovation segments. And then we're going to move on to innovation measures and assessment of likelihood. And then finally, gate reviews and recognition of good process. So these are somewhat complementary to each other, but equally can be implemented somewhat independently. As we go through this, you may be sort of ticking them off in terms of whether you do this well whether you do it at all or whether this is something you'd like to introduce. But what I'm kind of trying to do is I'm going to deep dive into these 6. You will have seen them in the previous session, but instead of just touching upon them, I'm going to do a bit more of a deep dive and try and pad them out a little bit. So let's focus on these first 2, the portfolio approach and protected funding for innovation segments. Now, these at first glance may not be what you're expecting to hear in terms of innovation climate, but bear in mind, I'm going to get there. So just bear with me as we go through this, and you'll begin to see why these connect to innovation climate factors, which in turn will foster the innovation behaviors we want to see. So firstly, as leaders, we need to balance the short and longer term investments. We cannot just focus on the incremental and expect to thrive. The pace of change is simply too fast. The level of disruption is too grand. We need to ensure that we have balance across our innovation portfolio so that we can not only protect our core, but also push into new areas and protect our future. And the portfolio approach is part of the puzzle when it comes to binding corporate strategy and innovation activities together. That's not always the case. Sometimes corporate strategy and innovation activities are disconnected. Sometimes innovation activities happen entirely independently and sometimes dip into complementing corporate strategy, but not necessarily. I would love those 2 to be highly connected, but they're often not the case. And there's a whole range of reasons for that, and we'll touch on some of them as we go through. Growth and profitability can come from a variety of sources, of course, but innovation is the source that protects our future. So that's why that one's so critical for us. And for some organizations, innovation is considered to be future sales. So we're used to perhaps thinking about, let's say, putting resources and time into sales and marketing activities for today, but we might not be thinking about what we're doing it for tomorrow. So for those of you perhaps in the services space where perhaps innovation has not been part of the DNA in the organization, that's a way of perhaps thinking about that. Now, complementing this is the Innovation Governance Board. This is something that I am a passionate believer in, which is a cross-functional committee of stakeholders who act as the intersection between the leadership of an organization and where the innovation activities happen. So they're the sorts of people who should be able to understand what growth and profit objectives an organization has, and to look at the variety of different choices that are available to an organization in terms of innovation energy, and decide which combination of activities should be focused upon in order to deliver the outcomes that the organization needs. Now, many organizations don't have an innovation governance board, and I think that's a problem because this is really the way in which leadership understands the work of innovation, and that innovation understands the direction of, or the aspirations of the company. And once you have that balanced portfolio where we've got a combination of maybe, let's say, incremental things and strategic things and more radical things, and you have some forecasts associated with those, the Innovation Governance Board can go to leadership and say, given we're trying to achieve this level of growth, this is what the combination of capabilities that we're expecting to invest in. Nothing's 100%, but as a weighted portfolio, we expect this to deliver X or Y in terms of growth over this period of time. That will have a confidence level if we independently assess value. We'll talk about that more later. We can then say to the leadership, would you prefer something that's more adventurous or something that's maybe more conservative? And we can adjust that portfolio of topics that we invest in according to the level of appetite that exists within leadership and, of course, the level of adventure that they wish to pursue. The objective here is to balance the short and the long term. And I talked about protecting innovation funding. And the reason for that, of course, is that often we fear that there's a short-termism associated with innovation decisions. The incremental always wins. Budget for today's sales is always focused and takes away from tomorrow. Many innovation programs still very heavily focus on the incremental, and that does make sense. But if we only do the short-term thinking, then that's going to be problematic. If you've seen this sort of picture before, this is an Ansoff matrix which plots our innovation activities on two scales, offerings and markets, current and new. As we go from the bottom left to the top right, there's greater levels of uncertainty, potentially bigger returns, but also less likelihood of success. And what we need is a combination of incremental, strategic, and disruptive concepts to ensure that we have balance in our innovation portfolio. If you feel that 90% of your work is in the incremental space, that's probably not going to protect your future. If you feel like 80% of it's in the disruptive space, there probably needs to be a very, very good reason for that to be the case, because that sort of probably is going to undermine your short-term profitability as well. So what we're talking about is balance. And in the past, you may have seen analysis on what the right combination of investment is, the so-called golden ratio. I don't believe in that because it doesn't take into consideration what is critical for an organization at a particular point in time. An organization that has some comfort may be prepared to shift more resources into strategic and disruptive areas. An organization that's under crisis may well need a very different kind of portfolio. So we need to take organizational context into consideration when getting that balance correct. That balance may shift, and I think it should shift, and it should be a fluid thing that we talk about with the Innovation Governance Board and leadership to make sure we've got the right combination of things. And this is just a portfolio approach. It's exactly how you might choose your financial investments or your pension investments. It's about making sure we've got the right balance of risk and adventure. Now, why these things help boost the innovation climate is that employees begin to see that all horizons are in focus. So it starts to remove that fear of, well, we're only ever thinking short term. We can also use communications to help explain the value that comes from quick wins, which is going to build belief from the more incremental space, but also demonstrate that we're future focused by showing the type of activities we're thinking about in the medium and longer term. Especially have some degree of transparency over innovation funnel, that can really help boost belief that the organization is still going to be there in 5 and 10 years and it isn't going to get left by the wayside. Now, we may move employees between concepts according to priorities, but the ideal is we should always make sure they're working on something important, whether it is incremental, strategic, or more radical. They always feel like there is value associated with what they're working on. So let's move on to the second combination of activity. And that might not make sense to you just yet, but hopefully it will in a second. So innovation measures are critical. And again, I think this is an area where organizations are not necessarily consistent and effective. The reason that measures are so critical is because if we measure the right things, we're more likely to make better decisions. And we're in a context now where we have higher levels of volatility. Some of you may have seen me present in the past where I put on the last 15 years and we did a snapshot on major business disruptions that made organizations make different decisions. So things like COVID or the tanker stuck in the Suez Canal. These higher levels of volatility and regular volatility mean that we need to have confidence in our choices and give ourselves a variety of different options and directions to take in the future. That means merit-based decisions are even more important than they ever have been. We need to be meritocracies. We can't have a situation where the innovation work is simply taken by the people with the right history of success or perhaps the right profile or the loudest voices. We need to make sure we're investing in the best stuff, irrespective of where that's coming from. And that in turn is going to help build trust between leaders and innovators if leaders can see what we're measuring, why we're measuring it, and it's consistent across our entire innovation portfolio. One of the biggest challenges is that we've often devolved the power to innovate into silos and everybody's measuring things differently and we don't have transparency on what they're working on, and that undermines trust and it undermines belief that leaders have in innovators in terms of taking the business where it needs to go. So having some consistency there in terms of what we're measuring and how we're going to report it, even if we allow a lot of flexibility in terms of how we're developing something, is a big step in building trust between leadership and innovators. And as a leader, we can impose these measures. We can impose a bit of structure here to create better governance. And when I talk about measuring the right things, there are a set of what I consider to be minimal viable measures or minimum viable innovation measures. And these are things like investment in, capacity and time in, return out or forecast impact, the timeline we're working to, and one which I'm going to come on to in a second, which is the likelihood of meeting our forecast. Even rough judgments that are refined and developed over time are helpful. And as long as we're consistent in terms of how we're measuring and what information we're recording on a particular concept, that is helpful. There will be additional measures that are specific to a particular concept that we're working on, but as a minimum, we need to know what's going in, what's coming out, what timeline are we working to, and how sure are we that this is going to be successful. Because that gives us the ability to do proper concept development, management, and make good portfolio decisions. So how do we actually even judge likelihood? Are we guessing? There's lots of different ways of doing this. But we need to consider the impact of innovations over time. We need to consider the likelihood that our judgment is correct. But we should also think about how we're judging that. Is it fair for us to ask the concept owner to say, I think this has got 90% chance of succeeding or a 10% chance of succeeding? They're, of course, always going to be biased towards their concept. And so having an independent assessment of likelihood is helpful. Now, we could do best guess. Prediction markets are also a helpful tool. I'll talk about that in a second. Some organizations use a head-to-head comparison where they'll look at a portfolio of concepts and they will judge them against each other, perhaps feasibility, viability, and the other one, which annoyingly has just escaped my memory. The prediction market is kind of interesting. Let's give you a quick example of that for those of you not familiar with prediction markets. This is an initiative that was started by Xerox back in the day, or certainly leveraged by Xerox as a way of forecasting desirability. Thank you, Sharav. I appreciate your support on that. Prediction markets are a way of predicting what is likely to happen in a more effective way than perhaps was done before. So I mentioned Xerox. They used to really struggle with knowing how many copiers they need to make for a particular market at a particular point in time. And every time they did a forecast, it was miles wrong. And of course, when you're producing goods, it's really important that you know roughly how many you're likely to sell, so you're not having stuff sat on shelves waiting to be sold. So they invited their customer-facing staff to make predictions and say, well, how many of these do you think you're going to sell next year? And how many of these do you think you sell next year? And it's way more effective. I think it's sort of 70% effective, far, far greater than any other technique. And this, again, is a way in which we can judge likelihood. If we know we have to innovate, we know we have to have resources on our strategic and radical things as well as our incremental things, then using a prediction market can be a helpful tool. The key thing, though, is independence assessment and not forcing concept owners to are, of course, passionate about their concept to reveal their biases in terms of likelihood. They should all be optimistic. They should care about this. So having either an innovation governance board or a local committee assessing likelihood, which may not necessarily be displayed to everybody, is usually the best way of going. And that might be, all right, it's a radical concept. We know it's only 10% likely, but we're prepared to experiment here and see if we can turn it into something. It might be an incremental concept where we're 90% sure this is going to get the impact that we expect over the timeline we expect. But again, that likelihood is just like an investment portfolio. It gives us that ability to weight and balance the combination of things that we're putting our energy into. And if we have completely autonomous divisions that are working independently on new things, just at least reporting what they're working on and these metrics and the likelihood still then can give us that portfolio view, even if the things they're working on are radically different to the next division. And the reason this has such an impact on innovation climate is it increases the awareness of what we're working on and the confidence in innovators from leadership, because they can see more consistency in terms of the numbers that they're looking at, the likelihood. Leaders understand investment portfolios. They understand like sales portfolios. What they struggle is the one egg in one basket scenario, as I like to think about it, which is, should we do this or shouldn't we do this? In most cases, that's the wrong question. It's what combination of things should we do? And does that give us the right return based upon where we're trying to take the business? Also, there's more consistency of decision making, better alignment, better results, of course, in the end. And all of that lifts all boats. Because if we're making better decisions and we're seeing more results and we're seeing more alignment in the organization, everybody feels that we're heading in that direction. And everybody, of course, is happier with that direction of travel. So that, of course, is helpful in terms of increasing engagement because people feel like they're working for a mature organization that's doing the right stuff. And to try and offer a counterpoint to what this might look like, you might work in an organization where decisions are being made by individuals and it's really about the individual rather than the concept. And perhaps we're not seeing the best stuff actually filtering through. But if we have some transparency, we have some consistent decision making, it's much more likely that irrespective of where those ideas and concepts are coming from, the right ones are being invested in combination with others. So two final topics, gate reviews and recognition of good process. And these are all very tangible things that hopefully every organization can implement. Let's start off with the gate review piece. And many of you will have sat in gate review committees. I know I used to as a corporate innovator, and frankly, it was a pretty unpleasant experience. I would sit there in front of a panel of around 10 people. I would tell them I needed a huge amount of money and give them a forecast and a likely market size and probably a 40 to 50 slide deck to review and why what I was working on was the best thing since bread was sliced. And of course, as you might imagine, they would try to find holes in that. And it was generally a fairly unpleasant conversation. This was back in a time where perhaps innovation maturity is not where it is today, but I still feel like gate reviews are not quite tuned to the point where we can maximize the value from that opportunity. And for those of you unfamiliar with gate reviews, essentially it's the staging points on our concept development process. So it might be as we're moving from, let's say, discovery stage into a proof of concept, or a proof of concept into a piloting phase, or a piloting phase into an implementation phase. Those are the gate keepers or the gate points between you move between phases, and usually they sit due to a significant change in activity. So as we're doing something new, we're taking it to another level, or perhaps it could be as a result of, let's say, an investment decision. We might have got to a point where we need a certain amount of money or a certain amount of people, which requires a higher level of the organization to sign it off. And so we have a gate review. So it might be stage gate, it might be an agile process that you use. That's not what's important. It's about this gate process that's so critical. Now, in the past, we tended to think about these as go or no go opportunities. And of course, that's what creates an awful lot of the anxiety for the concept owner. Is this going to end my initial project? And is that going to reflect badly on me? Of course, more smarter organizations will also consider the opportunity to iterate something that comes to a gate review. Perhaps we're not quite ready, but we can see where you're going and we like it. Let's see if we can make it a little bit better. But I'd also like to offer that these could be far more impactful. It could be a conversation where the committee says, well, can we help you? Can we make this even better than it is already? Can we give you access to other expertise that maybe could supercharge this or validate what you're working on? Maybe we could also engage a partner if that's going to be critical for you. How can we help make this better? And I think that's a really interesting conversation to have. So it's a question here from in the chat, how to decide on which stakeholders are the gatekeepers and what criteria. So in reality, it depends on the shape and size of the organization. For smaller organizations, it's likely to be that innovation governance committee, if it exists. In many cases, though, it should be a deliberately diverse group of people who are in charge of funding and capacity, and also connected to the overall innovation strategy within the organization. So it's almost easier to talk about this within the context of a specific company than it is in general. But they need to have responsibility for resources and for budget, and have the credit in the bank to be able to say yes or no according to the organization within which you work. You don't want a team of 20 at this point. 5, 7 max is usually what I would expect to see at a gate review. And ideally, you want people that are bringing different things to the party. So in the past, I know, for example, I've seen people that have, there'll be somebody from sales, there'll be somebody from legal, there'll be someone from finance who's looking over the numbers, there may be someone who from the capability group or operations group, and so on and so forth. So you've got some diversity there in terms of those skill sets, so that we're looking at things in the round. And maybe this is a point at which I can reference back to that prerequisite of having the ability to have collective intelligence initiatives where we can harness the wider community of people to support these kind of conversations is very, very helpful. So we consider collective intelligence as a utility available at any stage during our development cycle. We can run micro challenges and give more power to the concept owners so that they don't feel like they have to answer absolutely everything. One of the challenges of the concept owner, especially if you're dealing with innovation, is you might be pushing the boundaries of what's ever been done or possible before. By definition, you're dealing with uncertainty. And it's not really reasonable for that concept owner to know everything when we're pushing everything so hard. So instead, what we tend to think about is use them as coordinators and give them access to expertise, perhaps inside and outside the organization, to help support them to get them where they need to go. And it's a perfectly reasonable point for them to say, you know what, I don't think this is going anywhere. I'd like to work on something better or something that has a greater chance of success. But if we get the gate review point, we can say, I can see you've got a problem there. I can see that you don't have the people in your team to help you. Let's give you access to the collective intelligence of the organization or a targeted partner to see if we can get over that problem. And if we can't, we might have to stop this. But if we can, fantastic. We can accelerate your journey to results. I'll give you another example here. This was shared by a chemicals company at a recent roundtable I was at, where an organization had been wrestling with a problem for about 18 months. Simply couldn't get over this particular piece of chemistry, and they decided to reach out to their academic partners, and the problem had already been solved. It was a very simple solution, but it was just not something that the people they had inside the organization had ever worked upon. So the answers are out there. If we can accelerate our time to innovation, that's helpful, and collective intelligence is a key vehicle for that, whether we're refining something, validating something, or optimizing it and making it as good as it possibly can be. And don't forget the role of the ecosystem. So I'm going to go back to another question in the chat here, and this is going back to the gatekeepers. Are they same for all gate reviews, or can they change? Absolutely, they should be changeable. They're often chaired by the same people. You always typically have a legal person, you typically have a finance person, but you do need to ensure that they're following the same principles and rules, which is why having them chaired by the same person is a helpful thing to do. And usually the chair would be the senior innovation person or somebody in charge of growth. I've also seen it chaired by strategy as well. So it depends on the type of business that you have in terms of who has the chair. But that is the way in which you get continuity over the stage gate process and each of those projects. It needs to be chaired by the right person. Typically, you have 2 or 3 core members, and then we'll dip in and out other people that have views to help. The important thing to bring, though, to a gate review is a mindset of how do we help make this better? You've typically taken somebody who's very good, is experienced, who has probably a high level of education, who is maybe a good networker, some of your best people, and said, I'd like you to work on this thing. And if we make these combative, that just doesn't feel like the right tone. These should be a let's say a team effort. Yes, a great question. Would it induce cost to go with academia? Well, let me put it this way. If something's taking 18 months and we can solve it within 5 minutes by asking academia, it's probably worth the investment. Many of you will have established academic partnerships and they can sometimes be leveraged. But absolutely, the business case will need to be considered and whether we can afford it, for sure. All right, so moving on to rewards and recognition. And this is a kind of a pet topic for me, because if you think about, and I'd like you to just take a moment here, who gets the praise in your organization when it comes to innovation? And what is it that's actually incentivized? And what is it that you think you're recognizing? And those 3 are often different. So just take a moment to think about that. I want you to think about, are we only recognizing and incentivizing that red flag at the end of the journey, the ultimate implementation of a concept? Or are we incentivizing and recognizing the steps along the way? Are we praising the people that illustrate the behaviors that we want to see, or only the outcomes? It's an interesting point because often our incentive and rewards and recognition programs are not that well aligned to actual human motivations. And if you want to dig deeper into this topic, the person I always reference is Dan Pink, who talks about autonomy, mastery, and purpose. When I'm talking to organizations, what I find is that they typically will recognize only outcomes, but not necessarily innovation behaviors and not necessarily the steps along the way. Innovation often takes time. If I've got to wait 3 years to get any praise, to get any recognition, to be incentivized at all, that can be quite, that can be frustrating. Bearing in mind, you're often putting very good people on these things. We want to keep them motivated and enthusiastic and feel like they are being supported the whole journey. So we need to think carefully about recognizing good process, not just outcomes. The concept owner's job is to follow good process. If we look at implementation ratios, I was talking to a toy company recently, and they thought probably ratio of implementation was about 2% from idea through to implementation. In some organizations, it's about 1%. That means somewhere between 98 and 99% of the stuff that we're working on doesn't actually make it to implementation. And that's the world that we live in, right? We're living within a funnel. And certainly as we move into the more strategic and more radical spaces, ideas don't always get commercialized. That doesn't mean we're wasting all of our money, right? That's idea through to implementation. Lots of ideas don't get any investment at all. But there is a lot of stuff that we work on that doesn't necessarily make it. Maybe we have other priorities. Maybe there are challenges in that. The concept owner's role is to follow good process until the point at which they cannot pursue it any further. If the concept's found to be ineffective, the concept owner should also feel like, well, okay, I did everything I could. I've still done a great job. I'm going to capture my learnings. I'm going to bring it to a close, and I'm going to move on to the next thing. But I want you to think about whether we recognize that. And that is something that leaders can change. An example I've used before is this a list of awards from Tata, their Innovista program. They have a award called Dare to Try, basically an opportunity to give it a go. Somebody stepping outside of their comfort zone, perhaps, and saying, how can I make this a little bit better, even if they're not 100% confident this is going to work? So now we've got some questions coming in. So I'm just going to go a quick step back and just take a look at what questions we have and see if there's anything else we want to just address at this point. Yeah, okay, some more comments, and I like that. That's great. Thank you ever so much for sharing it. So the recognition of the outcome is important. We don't want to move away from that, but we should also be recognizing the step and celebrating the milestone, as is stated in the chat, at every single point. Great. So this has covered most of it. I'm just going to summarize this last section and we'll just bring everything to a close. So how does the last two elements actually impact innovation climate? Well, it increases the value and speed of innovation and also helps us fail faster, as Aki is pointing in the comments. It's going to build more confidence in innovation over time between leaders and innovators, and it's going to keep motivations high even when innovations fail. It's going to also help us make more mature concept decisions so that we're working on the right stuff at the right time in the right way with the right people allocated, which is something I think is in everybody's interests. So just to summarize, take a portfolio approach to investments. That really helps leadership. It really helps making sure there's some consistency. It's absolutely correct that an incremental concept is going to be measured very differently to a radical concept, but there are some things that are common. How much time and energy, what impact we're forecasting, what kind of value might this have, even if they're just rough judgments. It just helps us do a little bit of comparison. If we protect innovation funding for all zones and then just shift weighting according to priorities, it just helps everybody make sure that we feel like we're heading in the right direction. And that's the role of the Innovation Governance Board, to administer that process. Make sure we're measuring the right stuff. There are going to be lots of measures appropriate for a concept, but there's certain things that are important to ensure we filter up and create good governance around this, and where we independently assess the likelihood rather than just asking the concept owner to make a judgment. That's going to be helpful in terms of balancing that portfolio and having a much more just constructive conversation over our portfolio. Now, I wonder what recognize A was supposed to be. So apologies for that. There's an error in my slides, but just to illustrate, make gate reviews collaborative, supportive, and recognize all of the behaviors that you want to see. So thank you for joining. As mentioned, we got some time for questions. We've got 15 minutes left. If those to you want to share ideas, observations, I'm going to kick off with a request for you in a second. I would love you if you could just fill in this little QR code. If you could put that into your phone, follow the link, do a little survey, and as I said, anyone that does that will get put into a hat for a free consultation, which is something I really love doing. So my first question to you as participants here is, what other innovation behaviors do you think you would like to see from leadership, which could have a material impact on the culture and the environment within which you work. So the things that I haven't mentioned, there are lots of them, and I'm just interested in what you believe should also be considered. So courage, yes, love that. Thank you, Lorena. The courage to go a little bit, to take a step beyond. How do we foster courage? How would we measure that? I think we can see the behavior of courage, taking risk. I think, again, linking these points back to what we have covered, knowing that there is a portfolio approach where there's protected investments for more radical things promotes people taking a risk and having more courage. If they know the organization is prepared to put energy into more adventurous areas, they will feel that implicit permission to also participate. So I think those are really good points. What other things? Yeah, humility, especially from leadership. I think leadership accepting the fact that then they don't need to have all the answers. They are it's not an expectation that leaders going to tell us everything that's and how it should be, but instead to be a coordinator, to be a collaborator, to be able to leverage different expertise and knowledge within the organization and bring people together is a vital behavior. Leaders that simply think, I've got a single direction and I am right and I'm not listening to anybody else, I think that those times have passed. Yeah, learning culture is a really good one, and that's something that perhaps we haven't touched on too much today, but is absolutely part of the innovation climate. And I think just to tag it with some areas of interest, being able to say, we've completed this task, whether it was successful or not, this is what we learned, we've locked that in, and that's available for learning for others, is incredibly valuable. Being able to go back and say, this is what we learned on something that failed, potentially we can leverage that in the future, or this is what we learned on something that succeeded, hugely effective. Sharing those stories, again, it helps promote a learning culture. Yes, dedicated resources such as time and space, giving people permission to work on their own new ideas. That's a really interesting one. I think again, the collective intelligence bedrock of involving people, maybe just 5-10 minutes of their time is very helpful to that. I've started to see a shift in organizations, especially services organizations, in terms of trying to make time available for innovation. I've shared this story before, but Linklaters, the law firm, they actually consider time spent on innovation as productive time. That means it's counted just in the same way as billable time to a client. Now, I think there's a limit to that, but that's the first law firm that I've seen consider it in that way. Sometimes it is about space. Perhaps we need to bring people together physically, so they've got an opportunity. I've seen organizations put virtual spaces in place to give people the ability to come and work together from different locations. Win or learn mindset, bank, share, and apply learning, even if the innovation is successful. Absolutely. We just talked about that. Space for innovations. Yes, absolutely. Think about how do we make space and time for innovation? Now, different industries and organizations are different. The tactical is always going to be critical to an organization. The day job is always critical to the organization. But how can we take little slices of people's time and give them the opportunity to contribute? I think that's where we need to think thinking. It's not realistic for everybody to be running around with their own concepts in most organizations, certainly not for medium and large companies. We have a job to do, but that doesn't mean they don't have anything to add. Yeah, how to handle errors, absolutely. Mistakes, challenges. What is the mature way of dealing with that? And again, it kind of speaks again to mindset in an organization. What is it we want people to feel when they see an issue, a problem, make a mistake? Do they feel like they're in a supported organization that's going to pick them up and help try to move things forward, or are they going to get punished? That punishment is going to, or that criticism is going to undermine their ability and willingness to actually go and take risks and do something in the future. People need to feel like they're in a supportive environment when, as I said, an awful lot of stuff that we try doesn't quite work out. All right, fantastic points. Any other questions that people would like to throw in? Okay, so another great comment here. Frequent cold-eyed reviews and accept to be challenged. I think acceptance to be challenged is great, but also I think within a supportive environment where everybody's trying to achieve is the right tone to be struck. I think people should be able to defend what they're working on, and I think they should also be prepared to express where they're struggling or where they don't have all the answers and ask for help. Okay, so we've got a question here. Which executive level and function do you see as part of the Innovation Governance Board? Are they also the ones steering the portfolio balance? So I'll answer your second question first. So yes, typically the Innovation Governance is the one that's steering the portfolio balance. So they would normally have access to the ambitions of the leadership and be then looking at the portfolio as a whole and stating which combination of activities they believe is the right combination in order to meet those targets, and have a conversation with leadership about whether that's the right balance. You might imagine, if any of you sat with a pension advisor, they'll say, well, you're this age and you want to retire at this point, and we are advising you to go for a pension of this level of risk because of the time available to you. And as you get older, you get more and more conservative in terms of that level of risk. The innovation portfolio is no different, really. What you'd love to be able to do is to offer leadership a range of different options or combinations depending on their level of adventure, the disruption the business is facing, and what they're trying to achieve. So in terms of the people, as I said earlier, it does kind of depend on the shape of the organization and its nature. So what you would normally expect to see is strategists in there, somebody with some finance background, often somebody with a legal background, often something within the sort of the capability space. You may have a core group of people, and then you have other experts that dip in and out. So the core will typically provide the consistency, might be chaired by a chief innovation officer if you have one, and then you have your legal representatives, your financial representatives, and perhaps other line of business experts that dip in and out. It doesn't need to be 20 people strong. It might be 5 or 7 folks that actually are in that role of innovation governance board. Okay, so transparency, convince. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, what about who would you involve for the independent assessment likelihood for the forecast to be
Yeah, great
provided?
question. So that cannot typically happen at a more junior level. But again, it's the deliberate diversity that is important. Now, we talked earlier about prediction markets, and those are typically where we are involving very large groups of people to make predictions, and then we aggregate it as a wisdom of crowds type scenario in order to create the assessment of likelihood. Another option, of course, is to do a head-to-head comparison where you have maybe 10 stakeholders with deliberately diverse skill sets, and they're looking at, well, is this one likely to succeed more than that one? Is that one going to generate more revenue than this one? Which one do I feel more technically is feasible? And then it gives you that ranked list of priorities. So those are two alternatives. The alternative, of course, is that a group of people sit in a room and say, well, I think this is about 50% chance of meeting its forecast. And the types of people you want in there are often a mirror of what may sit at a governance board. So it depends on your structure and your size, of course, but let's suppose you're operating at a divisional level. There'll be a set of rules and principles put down by the Innovation Governance Board. And then they would say, okay, we need to assess it on these measures, and we want you to consider something of this type to be within this range and this range and this range. I do think there's a lot of value in a bit of wisdom of the crowd, even if the crowd is quite small, when it comes to assessing independent likelihood. We don't know for sure, right? So even in an incremental space, it might be 95% likely, but we don't know for sure until we do it. In a radical space, it might be 10% at this point. We hope to increase that likelihood as we develop it, but we don't know for sure. The important thing is not to be 100% right, is to follow the consistent process and then refine our approach over time.
All right. Thank you, Colin.
Great. So yeah, thank you for those people that have to drop. I think we have a couple more minutes. So yeah, another question, another point here, to have a clear innovation strategy. Otherwise, all ideas will be scattered, even if they're good ideas. I agree. And actually, I'm going to add to that point around innovation strategy, because I think it's tempting to put in place an innovation strategy and say, well, this is what we're trying to achieve. But there are some prerequisites to that, which I do think are climate factors, and they relate to assets and competencies. So anyone familiar with Rowan Gibson's work around the 4 lenses will be familiar with these terms. It's really important that an organization knows what it's good at. And I'm starting to see increasingly organizations to source what are we good at and what have we got. So what's our intellectual property portfolio look like? And what are our core competencies, which are different to what we sell? It's the things that we can leverage. And if we can leverage it, that helps us set our strategy. It tells us where we are. So if we have assets and we have competencies, we can then leverage those for new concept development, of course, for new business models, for purposes of change. That is critical, in my opinion, before we actually set out our strategy. Because otherwise, we're not entirely sure what it is we're going to be leveraging. So innovation strategy is great. I think it's really important, and it absolutely will avoid that issue that you mentioned earlier about scattered ideas. We want to make sure that we're building upon those activities that we can feasibly engage with. Awesome. Well, this has been a fantastic and very engaging session. Thank you ever so much for those people that have asked questions and offered your own suggestions about climate factors. There will be 2 more webinars coming up the remainder of this year, so look out for those. They will be broadcast very soon, both on my social media and through Hype. As I mentioned, if you haven't done already, please do take a look at that QR code, follow the link, fill in a little survey, and hopefully you'll get lucky and you'll get a little free consultation from me. Wonderful. Thank you very
Thank
much,
you so
everybody.
much, Colin. Amazing, like always. See you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.